So how does an ancient myth, a 3,000-year-old story about a Trojan prince and the king of the gods, end up naming the largest moon in our entire solar system? It's a wild story, right? We're talking about beauty, power, abduction, and a legacy that's literally written in the stars. Let's get right into it.
So, yeah, today we're diving deep into the myth of Zeus and Ganymede. It's a really complex story and honestly pretty controversial. We're going to unpack how this ancient Greek tale ended up immortalized up there in the cosmos.
All right, so our story kicks off in a way you've probably heard before with Greek myths. A mortal catches the eye of a super powerful god. But here's the thing. This was not your average mortal, and definitely not just any god.
So let's talk about Ganymede. Who was this guy? Well, for starters, he was royalty, a prince of Troy, actually, son of King Tros, the city's founder. But what he was really famous for? The myths all agree on this one. He was supposedly the most beautiful of all mortals. And get this, here's a little bit of wild mythology trivia for you. He was actually Zeus's great-great-grandson. Crazy, right? But even with all that royal blood, he was just living a pretty simple life as a shepherd up on Mount Ida. And it's right there, while he's just tending his sheep, that Zeus, the king of all the gods, spots him from way up on Mount Olympus. He's just completely captivated by Ganymede's insane beauty. So what does he do? He turns himself into a giant eagle, swoops down, and just snatches the young prince, carries him away from his mortal life forever. Okay, so this is where Ganymede's life completely flips upside down. He gets to Olympus, and Zeus gives him this super prestigious job. He's now the official cupbearer to the gods. He's the one serving them their nectar and ambrosia. But here's the juicy part, the real drama. To get that job, he had to replace someone, and that someone was Hebe, the goddess of youth, who also happens to be the daughter of Zeus's wife, Hera. Oh yeah, you can already see where this is going, right? We'll definitely come back to that. In exchange for all this, Zeus gives Ganymede two gifts that almost no other mortal ever got: eternal youth and immortality. So let's step back for a second. What was this? Was it this incredible honor, a grand act of love? Or was it just a straight-up violent abduction? Well, the answer is, it's complicated. Because believe it or not, how people saw this story has changed so much over the centuries. Let's dig into how that whole thing evolved. If you go way back to Homer's Iliad in the 8th century BCE, there's actually no mention of anything romantic or sexual. It's just a thing that happened. But fast forward a couple hundred years to the 5th and 6th centuries BCE, and yeah, it was pretty much universally seen as a story about romantic sexual love. Then the Romans come along, right? They have different values, and their take starts to focus way more on the tragedy of it all, the violence of the act. And then, much later, in the Christian era, the whole story gets a total makeover. It becomes this cautionary tale, a warning against what they called unnatural lust.
Okay, to really get the Greek perspective, we have to talk about this concept called pederastia. Now, this was a real socially accepted thing back then. It was a custom where an older man, the erastes, would take on a younger adolescent male, the eromenos, as a kind of mentee, and they'd have this romantic bond. For them, the story of Zeus and Ganymede was basically the divine blueprint for this entire practice.
And it's funny because even the great ancient philosophers were arguing about what this divine love was all about. You had Plato on one side, basically saying, nope, this is all about intense physical desire. But then you had Xenophon, who had a totally different spin on it. He argued that Zeus loved Ganymede for the beauty of his mind and soul, not just his looks. But as time marches on, that romantic interpretation really starts to fade, and a much, much darker one takes its place. One that's all about consent, or, the total lack of it. The words people used started to change, from abduction to rape. Roman poets really leaned into Ganymede's terror. And then you see artists, centuries later, like Rembrandt, he completely turns the myth on its head. He doesn't paint some beautiful, willing youth. He paints a terrified, crying baby, just to hammer home that feeling of complete helplessness. And this quote right here, from the Roman era, just perfectly captures that change in perspective. His guardians in vain lift their hands to the stars, and the savage barking of his hounds rises to the air. Wow, you can just feel the panic, right? The guardians are helpless, the dogs are going crazy. It paints a picture of pure tragedy, a million miles away from romance. And look, this whole mess wasn't just causing a stir down on Earth. Oh no, there was serious drama up on Mount Olympus. As you can probably guess, Zeus's wife, Hera, was absolutely furious.
I mean, come on. Not only was this another case of Zeus cheating, but it felt like a personal attack on her. Her own daughter, Hebe, got kicked out of her job as cupbearer to make room for Ganymede. Ouch.
So, despite all this controversy, all this drama, the myth left this incredible mark. And not just in paintings and poems, but literally up in the night sky. This is how it all connects. So Zeus puts the eagle he turned into up in the sky. That's the constellation Aquila. He honors Ganymede by making him the constellation Aquarius, the water bearer. The planet Jupiter, well, that's just the Roman name for Zeus. And finally, circling all the way back to our big question at the start, the largest moon orbiting Jupiter is named, you guessed it, Ganymede.
And the year 1610 is the key moment. This is when an astronomer named Simon Marius officially proposes the name Ganymede for this huge moon that Galileo had just spotted orbiting Jupiter. And just like that, in that one moment, this ancient, messy, complicated myth gets forever stitched into the fabric of modern science. It's pretty incredible.
So, you gotta wonder, why are we still talking about this story thousands of years later? I think the reason is, it's never really been just one story. Think about it. Ganymede has been so many different things to so many different people. He's the honored kid who becomes a god. He's the perfect model for same-sex love. He's the tragic victim of a powerful abuser. And he's even this deep philosophical symbol for the soul rising to a higher plane. He's all of these things, all at the same time, which is what makes him so fascinating.
And that kind of brings us to the big takeaway here. The actual myth of Ganymede, the basic plot points, they haven't changed in 3,000 years. But the way we tell that story, that has changed constantly. The myth is like a mirror, really. It reflects the values, the fears, the beliefs of whatever culture is telling it at the time. Which leaves us with a really interesting question to chew on. What do our changing stories about the past tell us about who we are right now?